The ink bled slightly into the coarse paper of the newspaper, the words as stark and spare as the man who wrote them. Elias Thorne reread the advertisement for the 10th time, his jaw tight. It felt like a betrayal, a cold business transaction laid over the grave of a love that had once filled every corner of his life. But sentiment could not mend a leaking roof, nor feed the stock when the snows came. He had tried a year alone, and the silence had nearly broken him. Winter was coming again, a predator stalking the edges of his land, and he was no longer strong enough to face it by himself. Widower rancher seeks a wife in name only, a practical arrangement for a practical woman. Must be of strong constitution, willing to work and expect no sentiment. Will provide passage, room, board, and protection. No romance, no questions asked or answered. Send reply to E. Thorne, Box 17, Redemption, Colorado Territory. He folded the paper, the crinkle of it loud in the quiet post office. He needed hands, not a heart. He needed a presence to keep the crushing loneliness at bay, but one that would not ask to breach the walls he had built around the hollow space where his own heart used to be. He had buried his Sarah, and with her, he had buried the man who knew how to love. What was left was a rancher, a survivor, and that was all. Hundreds of miles east, in a stifling parlor that smelled of judgment and wilting flowers. Clara Maeve read the same words. Her fingers, delicate and pale, traced the blunt, unfeeling print. No sentiment, no questions. The phrases were not a warning to her. They were a promise. They were salvation. In her small town, questions were the currency of ruin. Whispers followed her like a shadow, clinging to the hem of her dress. The stares of the righteous women, the leering glances of the men, they were a constant, suffocating reminder of what had been done to her, and what they all believed she was. She had been accused, tried, and convicted not in a court of law, but in the court of public opinion. A man of good standing had taken what was not his to take, and when his sin was discovered, he had painted her as the temptress, the fallen woman who led him astray. And they had believed him. They always believed the man. She was left with nothing but shame, a name whispered in disgust, and a future that looked like a long, dark corridor with no doors. Elias Thorne's advertisement was a door, a cold, uninviting one, perhaps, but it was an escape from the prison of her past, Colorado Territory. It sounded like the edge of the world, a place so vast and empty that even the most vicious rumors could not cross the plains to find her. A practical arrangement. She could be practical. She could work until her hands bled if it meant she could finally breathe air that was not thick with scorn. She penned her reply on the only clean sheet of paper she owned, her words as spare and formal as his. She was of good health. She wrote. She was not afraid of work. She accepted his terms. She did not mention that she was desperate, that his cold, demanding words were the kindest she had heard in a year. The train that carried her west was a rumbling, soot-stained beast, pulling her farther and farther from the life she had known. With each mile, the manicured green of the east gave way to an endless expanse of brown and gold, a land that was raw, untamed, and magnificent in its unforgiving honesty. It did not pretend to be soft. It did not hide its dangers. She found a strange comfort in that, when she finally stepped onto the platform in Redemption. A cold wind whipped around her, pulling at the thin wool of her coat. The town was little more than a single muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings, all of it dwarfed by a sky that was bigger and colder than any she had ever seen. Men in dusty hats and worn coats turned to look, their eyes lingering with a frank curiosity that was different from the leering she was used to, but no less unsettling. She saw him immediately. He stood apart from the others, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose stillness was a force of its own. His face was weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines of hardship that made him look older than his 30-some years. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on her, assessing. There was no welcome in his gaze, only a grim acknowledgement. This was Elias Thorne. He was exactly the man she had expected from his advertisement. "Miss Maeve." His voice was a low rumble, rough around the edges. "Mr. Thorne," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. She clutched her single carpet bag, the handle worn smooth from her nervous grip. He gave a curt nod, his eyes flicking over her. She knew what he saw. A woman too slight for this country, with clothes too fine, no matter how worn they were. She saw the flicker of doubt in his expression, and a familiar chill of fear traced its way down her spine. "The wagon is this way," he said, turning without waiting for a reply. He took her bag from her hand, his calloused fingers brushing against hers for a bare second. The touch was impersonal, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her, a startling reminder of how long it had been since anyone had touched her with anything other than malice or pity. The ride to his homestead was a silent one. The wagon rattled over the frozen ruts of the trail, the only sounds the creak of the wheels, the snort of the horses, and the ceaseless moan of the wind. Clara pulled her thin coat tighter, watching the landscape unfold around her. It was a place of brutal beauty. Snow clung to the hollows of the rolling plains, and the mountains in the distance were jagged teeth against the gray sky. The land felt ancient and indifferent, a place that could swallow a person whole and never notice they were gone. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a tiny, strange seed of hope began to sprout. Here, she could be just as small and insignificant as she felt. Here, she could disappear. They reached a river, swollen and gray with melted snow from the high country. The current was strong, pushing against the wagon wheels with a hungry sound. Elias did not hesitate, guiding the horses into the churning water with a steady hand. For a terrifying moment, the wagon seemed to lift, and Clara's hands flew to the wooden seat, her knuckles white. Elias glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Hold on," was all he said. She obeyed, her eyes fixed on his hands as he expertly handled the reins, his focus absolute. He was a part of this harsh land, as strong and unyielding as the rock formations that jutted from the plains. They reached the other side, the horses straining as they pulled the wagon up the muddy bank. He had not offered her a word of comfort, yet, in his competence, she had felt a flicker of safety. His homestead was nestled in a small valley, a simple log house and a large barn standing stark against the snow-dusted landscape. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a lonely gray ribbon against the endless sky. As they drew closer, she saw the truth of the place. The fences were in need of mending. A shutter on the house hung from a single hinge, and an air of neglect clung to everything, as if the life had been drained from it. This was not just a home. It was a place of deep, abiding grief. He pulled the wagon to a halt and jumped down. "We are here." He helped her down, his grip firm and brief on her arm. Inside, the house was dark and cold, smelling of wood smoke and solitude. It was a man's house, functional and devoid of any softness. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, surrounded by a few pieces of sturdy, hand-carved furniture. Everything was clean but worn. He stood before the cold hearth, his hat in his hands, and finally looked at her directly. His gaze was as stark as the winter plains outside. "We should set the terms of our arrangement now, Miss Maeve, so there are no misunderstandings." Clara nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "This is a partnership, not a marriage in the traditional sense. You will have your own room." He gestured with his head toward a door at the far end of the room. "That one. It was it will be yours. My room is upstairs. You are not to enter it. I will not enter yours. We will treat each other with respect, as befits two people sharing a roof. You will help with the chores inside and out, as you are able. I will provide for you and ensure your safety. There will be no questions about my past, and I will ask none about yours." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "Is that clear?" "Yes, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. "That is perfectly clear." He seemed satisfied with her simple acceptance. "Good. You can put your things in your room. I will see to the horses." He left her standing in the middle of the cold, quiet room. Clara let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. The rules were cold, but they were a shield. No questions. He was offering her the one thing she craved more than anything, a blank slate. Her room was small and spare, containing a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wooden dresser, and a single window that looked out onto the vast, empty plains. It was cold, the air still and biting, but it was hers, a place where she could close the door and be alone, unburdened by watching eyes. She placed her bag on the bed and began to unpack the few belongings she owned. 2 simple dresses, a change of underthings, a brush, and a small, worn Bible. It was the sum of her entire life. Without a moment's hesitation, she began to work. She saw the dust on the mantelpiece, the ashes in the hearth, the general state of disarray that spoke of a man living alone with his sorrow. She found a broom and swept the floors, her movements quiet and efficient. She laid a fire in the hearth, coaxing the embers back to life until a small, cheerful blaze began to push back the oppressive cold. She found potatoes and onions in the pantry and set a pot of soup to simmer over the flames. She did not work to impress him. She worked because the simple, honest labor was a comfort. It was something she could control. That night, after a silent meal where the only sounds were the scrape of spoons against bowls and the howl of the wind outside, she retreated to her room. The cold seemed to seep in through the log walls. She lay in the narrow bed, fully dressed beneath the thin quilt, and listened to the sounds of the wilderness. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and in the distance, she heard the lonely, chilling cry of wolves. It was a sound that should have terrified her, but it felt like a song of the land, a lullaby of her new, desolate life. It was the sound of a place where a woman's past could be swallowed by the sheer, overwhelming size of the present. She curled into a tight ball, shivering, and for the first time in a very long time, she slept without dreaming of angry faces and pointing fingers. Days bled into one another, marked by the rising and setting of a pale winter sun. A routine, stark and unspoken, formed between them. Elias would rise before dawn, his heavy boots echoing on the floorboards above her head. He would work outside all day, tending to the cattle, mending the endless line of fences, his form a dark silhouette against the white snow. Clara managed the house. She cooked and cleaned, mended his worn clothes with neat, almost invisible stitches, and learned the rhythms of the homestead. Elias found himself watching her when he thought she would not notice. He had hired a pair of hands, but he had gotten something more, something he had not bargained for and did not want. He noticed the way she moved, a quiet grace that seemed out of place in his rough-hewn house. He would come in from the cold, and a pot of stew would be warm on the hearth. His socks, stiff with mud the day before, would be clean and dry by the fire. One afternoon, he heard her humming, a soft, sad tune that drifted from the kitchen. The sound was like a ghost, a whisper of the life that had once filled these rooms, and it made an unfamiliar muscle in his chest ache. He stamped his boots loudly on the porch, and the humming stopped. He told himself it was for the best. He needed to remember the terms of their agreement. But it was difficult. He noticed the small things, the way she folded the blankets, her hands smoothing the fabric with a gentle care he had not seen since Sarah, the way the firelight caught the reddish strands in her dark hair when she bent to stir the soup. He would feel a flicker of curiosity, a desire to know what brought a woman like her to a place like this. But he would push it down, deep and hard. He had promised her no questions. It was a promise he intended to keep, for her sake and for his own. For Clara, the quiet, laborious days were a balm. The physical exhaustion left no room for the ghosts that usually haunted her waking hours. But in the quiet moments, in the dead of night, they returned. She would lie in her cold bed and remember. The memory was not a story, but a feeling, a sickness that started in her stomach and spread through her limbs. She could feel the phantom pressure of a man's hands on her, rough and demanding. She could hear the echo of his lies, twisting her fear into something ugly and complicit. She would touch the faint, silvery scar on her shoulder, hidden beneath her dress, a permanent reminder of her struggle and his cruelty. They had called her a wanton woman, a sinner. They had stripped her of her dignity with their words, their judgment of far more brutal assault than the one she had suffered in private. She had come west to escape the words, but she could not escape the memory etched into her own skin. 2 weeks after her arrival, the sky turned a bruised, heavy gray. The wind picked up, howling with a new fury, and snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, blinding curtain. The storm descended upon them without warning, a white tyrant that erased the world. For days, they were trapped inside the small house, the snow piling in deep drifts against the doors and windows. The silence, once a comfort, now felt charged and heavy. The house shrank around them, forcing them into a proximity that their careful rules had been designed to avoid. They moved around each other like ghosts, their shoulders sometimes brushing in the narrow hallway, a spark of contact that made them both flinch and pull away. On the 3rd day of the storm, Elias was checking the security of the window shutters in the main room. The wind was battering the house, and he needed to ensure they would hold. He finished his task and turned, intending to go back upstairs to his room. The door to her room was slightly ajar. He assumed she was in the main room with him, perhaps by the fire. He pushed the door open to close it, to give her the privacy he had promised. And then he froze. She was standing in the middle of the room, her back to him. She had evidently been in the middle of changing her clothes. Her dress was pooled at her feet, and she stood only in her thin chemise and drawers. The light from the single window was weak, but it was enough. It illuminated the delicate curve of her spine, the slim line of her waist, the startling white of her skin against the gloom of the room. She was so slender, almost fragile, yet there was a strength in the set of her shoulders. He should have turned away instantly. He should have closed the door, muttered an apology, and retreated. It was what their agreement demanded. It was what his own code of honor required, but he could not move. His feet felt nailed to the floor. His eyes, against his will, traced the shape of her. It had been so long since he had seen a woman's form, so long since he had allowed himself to even think of it. Then his gaze snagged on something just over her shoulder blade, a scar, a pale, jagged mark against the perfection of her skin. It was not an old, faded thing, but one that spoke of a wound that had been deep and violent. Clara felt it before she heard it, a shift in the air, the prickling sensation of being watched. She spun around, her arms instinctively crossing over her chest. Her eyes met his, wide with shock and a deep, mortifying shame. A small gasp escaped her lips. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Elias's expression was unreadable, a mask of stone, but his eyes were a different story. They were fixed on her, and in their depths, she saw not disgust, not judgment, but a raw, unguarded intensity. His gaze lingered, tracing the line of her collarbone, the curve of her arm where she held herself tight, before finally, unwillingly, meeting her own. In that long, silent moment, the first and most important rule he had laid between them was irrevocably broken. His eyes had lingered far too long, and in their depths, she had seen not a man hiring help, but simply a man looking at a woman. He finally took a step back, his throat working as if to say something, but no words came. He pulled the door shut with a soft click, leaving her alone in the sudden, deafening silence, her heart hammering against her ribs. The click of the latch was a sound as loud as a gunshot in the suffocating silence of the small room. Clara stood frozen, her own breathing ragged in her ears, the cold floorboards biting at the soles of her feet. Shame, hot and familiar, washed over her. a tide that threatened to pull her under. It was not his seeing her that felt so violating. It was the look in his eyes, the raw, unguarded intensity. It was the look of a man, and the look of a man was a thing she had learned to fear above all else. The image of his face, stark and unreadable in the doorway, dissolved and was replaced by another, Mr. Abernathy. His face was always flushed. His breath smelled of sweet brandy and something sour beneath. He had smiled at her, a wet, knowing smile. Just before his hands had closed around her arms, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "A pretty little thing like you shouldn't be so shy," he had whispered, his voice a foul thing in the clean air of the library where she worked. "You know you want the attention." She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to banish the memory. But Elias Thorne's gaze had unlocked something deep inside her, a Pandora's box of fear and humiliation. Abernathy's voice echoed in the small cabin, mingling with the howl of the wind. He had told them all that she had lured him, that she had been improper, that her quiet nature was a clever guise for a wanton heart, and they had listened. They had looked at her with disgust. The same women who had praised her needlepoint now crossing the street to avoid her, their faces pinched with self-righteous contempt. Clara stumbled back to her bed and pulled the thin dress on over her chemise, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. Her body felt like it was not her own, a thing that had been judged, marked, and discarded. The scar on her shoulder blade, the one Elias's eyes had caught upon, throbbed with a phantom pain. It was a brand, a permanent testament to the moment her life had been torn apart. She curled up on the bed, pulling the quilt around her shoulders, but it could not ward off the chill that came from within. The storm outside was a tempest, but it was nothing compared to the one raging inside her. The snow stopped the next morning. A profound, world-altering silence fell over the homestead, broken only by the drip of melting snow from the eaves. The world outside was a pristine, rolling expanse of white, the sunlight on it so bright it hurt the eyes. It was a world wiped clean, a blank page. Elias was different. The awkwardness between them was a palpable thing, a third presence in the room. He avoided her gaze, his movements stiff and deliberate. He ate his breakfast of salted pork and biscuits, standing by the hearth, his back to her. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, as if it had rusted overnight. "The storm has passed. There is work to be done. You need to learn how to manage the animals. I cannot always be here." It was a practical statement, nothing more, but Clara understood. He was rebuilding the wall between them, brick by cold. Practical brick. She was grateful for it. She needed that wall as much as he did. "Yes, Mr. Thorne," she said quietly. "Show me what I need to do." He took her to the barn, the cold air a sharp slap to the face. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the smell of hay and livestock. The lowing of the cattle and the soft nickering of the two horses were comforting sounds. He showed her how to measure out the feed, how to break the ice in the water trough, how to check the animals for any signs of sickness. His instructions were clear, concise, and impersonal. He handed her a pitchfork. "The stalls need mucking out." Her hands, accustomed to the delicate work of mending and cooking, were soft and uncalloused. The rough wood of the pitchfork handle was alien. She worked for hours, her back screaming in protest, her arms aching with a fatigue she had never known. By midday, angry red blisters had formed on her palms. One broke, the sting of it sharp and clean. She said nothing, gritting her teeth and continuing her work, her movements becoming slow and clumsy. Elias returned to the barn to find her struggling to lift a bucket of water, her face pale with exhaustion. He did not speak. He simply took the bucket from her grasp, his calloused fingers brushing against her raw skin. She flinched. He stopped, his gaze falling to her hands. He saw the blisters, the angry red skin, the smear of blood where one had torn open. A muscle tightened in his jaw. He set the bucket down, turned, and left the barn. Clara's heart sank. She had failed. She was not strong enough for this life, for this place. She was a disappointment, just as everyone back home had said she was. She blinked back the hot sting of tears, refusing to let them fall. He returned a few moments later carrying a small tin. He came to her, took her hand gently in his, and turned it over to inspect the palm. His touch was surprisingly careful, the roughness of his skin a strange contrast to the gentleness of his hold. Clara stood rigid, her breath caught in her throat. He opened the tin, which contained a dark, pungent salve. Without a word, he dipped his fingers into it and began to carefully smooth the ointment over her blisters. The salve was cool and soothing, but it was his touch that made her tremble. It was a touch of pure, practical care, devoid of any sentiment. Yet it felt more intimate than anything she had ever known. He finished the one hand and reached for the other. When he was done, he wrapped both of her hands in clean strips of cotton cloth. "You will wear gloves tomorrow," he said, his voice low. He did not meet her eyes. He turned and went back to his own work, leaving her standing there, her hands swaddled like a child's, her heart beating a wild, unsteady rhythm. That night, a new dynamic settled between them. The silence was still there, but it was no longer entirely empty. As she knelt by the hearth to warm her bandaged hands, her sleeve, loosened by her work, slipped down her arm. In the flickering firelight, her skin looked pale and fragile. Elias, sitting at the table cleaning a rifle, looked up. His eyes rested on her arm for a moment that stretched into an eternity. It was the same look as before, the same unguarded intensity, but this time there was something else mixed in, something softer. Pity? Concern? He looked away, but not before she saw the conflict in his face. He was a man bound by his own rules, and she was a constant, living temptation to break them. A slow, tentative softening began in Clara's heart. She started to see the man behind the stern facade. She saw the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes at the end of a long day. She saw the deep, abiding sadness that settled over him when he thought no one was watching. She noticed his hands, how they were calloused and scarred from years of hard labor, yet how gentle they could be when tending to a sick calf or, she now knew, a woman's blistered palms. He was a man of profound sorrows, a man who had walled off his heart not out of cruelty, but out of a need to survive. She understood that kind of survival. A week later, they needed supplies. The ride into redemption was cold, the sky a vast, indifferent blue. The town felt different to Clara now. She was no longer a complete stranger. She was Elias Thorne's mail-order bride, a subject of quiet speculation and gossip. She could feel the eyes on her as she walked beside him into the general store, a long, cluttered room that smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dust, while Elias spoke to the proprietor about a new axe handle. Clara browsed the shelves, her fingers tracing the patterns on a bolt of calico fabric. It was a small, simple pleasure, a reminder of a life that felt a world away. "Well now, look what we have here." The voice was thick with liquor, the words slurred. Clara turned. A large, bearded man in a filthy buckskin coat leaned against the counter, a half-empty bottle of whiskey clutched in his hand. His eyes, small and bloodshot, roamed over her, stripping her bare. "Thorne's pretty little package from back east," the man sneered. "Heard he ordered himself a wife. Tell me, girl, does he treat you right? Or does a man get lonely out on that homestead of his?" He took a stumbling step closer. "A woman like you look like you got secrets." Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. The man's leering grin was a grotesque echo of Abernathy's. The shame, the feeling of being soiled by a man's gaze, came rushing back. She felt small, helpless, her voice trapped in her throat. Before the man could take another step, Elias was there. He had not moved quickly. Yet he seemed to materialize between Clara and the drunk. He was a wall of silent, cold fury. He did not raise his voice. He did not even look at the man. His eyes were fixed on the store owner, who was watching with a nervous expression. "Jedediah," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You are drunk, and you are speaking to my wife." He said the words, "my wife," with a finality that hung in the air like the edge of a blade. The drunk, Jedediah, snorted. "Just being friendly. Thorn, no need to get—" Elias turned his head slowly, and his winter sky eyes finally settled on Jedediah. The effect was immediate. The drunkard's smirk faltered. Elias's gaze was flat, devoid of emotion, and utterly chilling. It promised a kind of violence that was far more terrifying than a loud threat. "Go home, Jedediah," Elias said quietly. "Sleep it off, and do not speak to her again." Jedediah stared for a moment longer. Then his bluster seemed to deflate. He muttered something under his breath, shoved his bottle into his coat, and shuffled out of the store, the bell above the door jangling mockingly in his wake. Elias turned to Clara. Her face was ashen. He saw the terror in her eyes, a deep, haunted fear that went far beyond the unpleasantness of the encounter. He placed a hand on her elbow, his grip firm and steadying. "Are you all right?" She could only nod, unable to speak. He had defended her. He had called her his wife. The words were part of their arrangement, a convenience for the outside world. But he had said them with such conviction, such possessive protection, that they had sounded real. For a fleeting, dizzying moment, she had felt seen. She had felt safe. And then the shame crashed back down. If he knew the truth, if he knew the names they had called her, would he still have defended her? Or would he have looked at her with the same disgust as everyone else? He would surely send her away. The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. That night, the tension of the day lingered. They sat by the fire, the silence stretching between them. Elias poured 2 cups of coffee, the bitter, bracing aroma filling the room. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing hers. She did not pull away. She was staring into the flames, the encounter at the store replaying in her mind. When she felt him move, a strand of her hair had come loose from its bun and had fallen across her cheek. Slowly, hesitantly, Elias reached out. His calloused fingertips, impossibly gentle, brushed the strand of hair from her skin, tucking it behind her ear. The touch was electric. It was the lightest, most fleeting of gestures, but it sent a tremor through her entire body. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. He was looking at her with an expression of such profound, conflicted tenderness that it stole her breath. It was the look of a man who was breaking his own heart, rule by painful rule. She trembled, but she did not move. She held his gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a recognition that the simple, practical arrangement they had made was becoming something far more complicated, something that neither of them had bargained for. Later, in the cold sanctuary of her room, she lay in the dark, her body humming with a strange new energy. She lifted her hand and touched her own cheek, right where his fingers had been. The skin tingled. Her reaction startled her. For so long, a man's touch had meant only fear and pain. But his touch had been different. It had been gentle. It had been kind. And in the lonely darkness of the Colorado wilderness, she allowed herself to feel, for the first time, a flicker of something that was terrifyingly, wonderfully close to hope. The hope was fragile, and the land was not kind to fragile things. 2 nights later, a thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains, a violent, angry beast of a storm. Rain lashed against the house, and lightning split the sky, followed by crashes of thunder that shook the very foundations of the log walls. Clara lay awake, listening to the storm, when a new sound reached her, a frantic, terrified whinnying from the barn. Then she smelled it, smoke. She threw off her blankets and ran into the main room just as Elias came pounding down the stairs, pulling on his boots. "The barn!" he yelled over the roar of the storm. "A lightning strike!" Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. The animals, the horses. He grabbed 2 buckets and shoved one into her hands. "The well!" They ran out into the maelstrom. The rain was a solid wall of water, and the wind tore at their clothes. A horrifying orange glow pulsed from the barn, smoke billowing from a hole in the roof. The smell of burning hay was thick and acrid. They worked in a frantic, desperate rhythm, hauling bucket after bucket of water from the well and throwing it against the burning wall of the barn. It was a hopeless task. The fire was growing, feeding on the dry hay inside. "The horses!" Elias shouted, his face grim in the firelight. "We have to get them out!" He kicked open the large barn doors. A wave of heat and smoke rolled out. Inside, the terrified animals were screaming, their eyes wide with fear. Elias plunged into the smoke without hesitation. Clara, her heart hammering against her ribs, followed him. She grabbed the lead rope of the mare, her hands shaking, and began to coax the terrified animal toward the door. The horse reared, its eyes rolling, but Clara held on, speaking to it in a low, soothing voice she did not know she possessed. She got the mare out into the rain-swept yard just as Elias emerged leading the gelding. They had saved them. But the barn was now fully engulfed, the flames leaping high into the stormy sky, a funeral pyre for all his hard work. The fight went out of Clara all at once. The terror, the adrenaline, the smoke, and the rain all crashed down on her. She sank to her knees in the thick, cold mud, the rain plastering her thin nightgown to her body, and she began to sob. It was not a quiet, gentle weeping. It was a storm of grief, a raw, wrenching sound that came from the deepest, most broken part of her soul. She cried for the barn, she cried for the cruelty of this land, and she cried for the ruined, shamed girl she had been, a girl she could never escape. Strong arms came around her. Elias lifted her from the mud as if she weighed nothing. He carried her back to the house, his jaw set, his face streaked with soot and rain. He did not speak, but his arms held her tight against his chest, shielding her from the storm. He set her down in a chair by the fire and wrapped her in a thick wool blanket. Her sobs slowly subsided into shuddering breaths. He knelt before her, his expression unreadable. Her hair was soaked, dripping water onto the floor. He took a dry towel and, with an infinite aching gentleness, began to dry her hair. His large, rough hands were careful, his movements slow and deliberate. He cupped the back of her head, his touch lingering on her shoulder, right over the place where her scar was hidden. It was a touch of profound, unspoken comfort, a promise of protection in the heart of the storm. And in that moment, huddled by the fire, with the smell of smoke in the air and the sound of the rain on the roof, Clara knew that the simple arrangement was over. Something new, something terrifying and beautiful, had begun. The aftermath of the fire settled over the homestead like a fine layer of ash. The blackened skeleton of the barn stood against the sky, a stark monument to what they had lost and what they had survived. In the quiet, laborious days that followed, something between Elias and Clara shifted. The carefully constructed walls of their arrangement had been breached by shared terror and unspoken comfort. They no longer moved around each other like strangers. They moved with a new awareness, a fragile knowledge of the other's presence that was both a comfort and a constant, low-grade torment. For Elias, this new awareness was a ghost. He would watch Clara as she moved about the cabin, her quiet efficiency a balm to the chaos of his life, and he would feel a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so foreign he almost did not recognize it. Then, the ghost of Sarah would appear at his shoulder, her laughter echoing in the silent rooms, her memory a sharp, sudden pain. Sarah had filled this house with light and life, and this house had taken her from him. She had died in their bed upstairs. her body broken by the birth of the son who had followed her into death a day later. He had promised himself he would never risk that kind of pain again. He had built his life on a foundation of solitude, a fortress against the devastation of love. Clara was a threat to that fortress. Her gentle strength, the haunted look in her eyes that called to something protective in him, the unexpected grace in her small hands. It was all a betrayal of the promise he had made to his dead wife. He was falling for her. A slow, terrifying descent into a valley of emotion he had sworn never to enter again. He fought it with everything he had, suppressing the urge to touch her, to ask her the questions he had promised he would not, to bridge the remaining distance between them. He became quieter, sterner, his silence a weapon against his own heart. Clara, unaware of the war raging inside him, was undergoing her own quiet transformation. The fragile woman who had stepped off the train was being slowly burned away by the harsh realities of frontier life, leaving behind something stronger, something tempered by hardship. The fire had awakened a primal survival instinct she never knew she possessed. The helplessness she had felt for so long was being replaced by a steady, growing competence. The chicken coop had been damaged in the storm, its small door torn from its leather hinges. Elias, consumed with salvaging what he could from the barn and planning its rebuilding, had not had time to see to it. One morning, Clara found the hammer and a handful of bent nails. She spent the entire day working on the coop, her movements clumsy at first, then more sure. She hit her thumb, the pain a sharp, grounding shock. She got a splinter in her finger and patiently worked it out with a needle by the firelight that evening. By the next afternoon, the door was rehung, swinging securely on new leather straps she had cut herself. It was a small, clumsy repair, but it was hers. When Elias saw it, he stopped, his eyes taking in the rough handiwork. He said nothing, but a look of grudging respect flickered in his eyes before he turned away. Clara felt a surge of pride, a feeling so unfamiliar it almost made her dizzy. Her newfound strength was not confined to the homestead. On their next trip to Redemption for supplies, they once again entered the general store. The proprietor, a sour-faced man named Silas Croft, had always treated her with a cool disdain, his eyes assessing her as if she were a piece of livestock. While Elias was loading sacks of flour into the wagon, Clara approached the counter to pay for a spool of thread. "That will be 4 cents, Croft said, his eyes flicking over her simple dress. "Must be nice, having a man to pay for all your little fripperies." The old Clara would have flushed with shame, paid her money, and fled. The new Clara met his gaze without flinching. Her voice was quiet, but as firm and unyielding as the mountains on the horizon. "I earn my keep, Mr. Croft, just as you do." Silas Croft blinked, taken aback by her directness. He took the coins from her outstretched hand without another word. As Clara walked out of the store, her back straight, she felt as if she had won a great battle. She was no longer a victim of whispers and scorn. She was a woman who could stand on her own 2 feet, even if they were planted in the mud of a town that did not want her. Elias had been watching this all. He had seen the slow, steady blossoming of her spirit. One morning, he rose before the sun, a restlessness driving him from his bed. He walked toward the rise behind the house and stopped, concealed by a stand of aspen trees. Down below, in the meadow still silvered with dew, was Clara. She had taken off her shoes, and her dark hair was unbound, tumbling over her shoulders. She was moving through the tall grass, her arms outstretched, a slow, graceful turning that was not quite a dance, but something more elemental, more free. And then she lifted her face to the pale dawn sky, and she smiled. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly smile. It was not the small, hesitant curving of her lips she sometimes offered him. This was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy, a private communion with the morning. It transformed her face, erasing the shadows of fear and sorrow that usually clouded her features. In that moment, she was beautiful. not with the fragile elegance he had first noticed, in a way that was vibrant, alive, and utterly captivating. It struck him with the force of a physical blow. The fortress around his heart did not just crack, it crumbled into dust. He loved this woman. The realization was terrifying, and it was undeniable. He turned and walked back to the house, his heart a wild, chaotic thing in his chest. The arrival of the mail wagon was a rare event, a fragile link to the world they had both left behind. The driver handed Elias a small stack of letters and a single, lumpy package. Elias sorted through the mail, his face impassive. He handed the package to Clara. "This is for you." Clara looked down at the brown paper parcel, tied with twine. The postmark was from her hometown in Pennsylvania. Her name was written in a familiar, spidery hand. A cold dread washed over her, so intense it made her feel faint. The past had found her. Someone had found her. Her hands trembled as she took the package, the rough paper feeling alien and threatening beneath her fingertips. She glanced up at Elias, her eyes wide with a panic she could not conceal. He was watching her, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice low. "No," she lied, the word catching in her throat. "No, it is nothing, just unexpected." She fled to her room, her heart pounding. She sat on the edge of her bed, the package in her lap, feeling as if she were holding a venomous snake. With trembling fingers, she untied the twine and tore away the paper. Inside was a small, leather-bound book of poetry and a single, folded letter. The handwriting was her mother's, but the words were not words of love or forgiveness. They were words of condemnation. Her disgrace had followed her sister, ruining her marriage prospects. The family name was sullied. The letter begged her to never contact them again, to disappear completely, so that they might have a chance to salvage their lives from the wreckage she had left behind. She did not cry. The pain was too deep for tears. She was an anchor, dragging down everyone she had ever loved. She carefully folded the letter and hid it with the book deep inside her small carpet bag, burying it beneath her spare dress. She would not let Elias see it. She would not let this new, fragile life be poisoned by the old one. But the past, once unearthed, could not be so easily reburied. That night, the ghost came for her in her sleep. She walked, her eyes open but unseeing, her hands outstretched as if to ward off a blow. She whimpered in the darkness, small, broken sounds of protest. "No, please, it was not my fault. Do not touch me." Elias, awakened by the sound, came down the stairs. He found her in the middle of the main room, caught in the grip of a nightmare, her body trembling, his heart clenched. He wanted to go to her, to shake her awake, to hold her until the trembling stopped. But he knew that might frighten her more. Instead, he took the thick wool blanket from the back of his chair and gently, carefully, draped it around her shoulders. The weight and warmth of the blanket seemed to penetrate her nightmare. She stopped moving, her body going still. She let out a long, shuddering sigh, and her eyes, still clouded with sleep, focused on him. "Elias?" she whispered, her voice thick with confusion. "You were dreaming," he said, his own voice rough with emotion. She looked down at the blanket, then back at him, a dawning awareness and a deep shame in her eyes. I am sorry. I did not mean to wake you." "There is nothing to be sorry for." He led her to the hearth, where the embers of the fire still glowed, and sat her down on the braided rug. He added a log to the fire, coaxing it back to life. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the flames and the steady ticking of the mantel clock. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on the fire. "I was accused of being something I am not." It was a confession, but it was also a test. She did not look at him, terrified of the judgment she was sure she would see in his eyes. Elias did not press her. He did not ask for details. He simply accepted her words, her small, fragile offering of truth. "I know," he said quietly. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "How could you know?" "I see you, Clara," he said, his voice soft. "I see the woman who fixed the chicken coop with her own 2 hands. I see the woman who faced down Jedediah in the store. The things I see do not match the words of a liar or a sinner." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the firelight. It was the kindest, most healing thing anyone had ever said to her. He saw her. He did not see her shame. He saw her strength. He reached out and took her hand. His grasp was warm and firm, enclosing her smaller hand completely. They sat like that for a long time, side by side on the rug, not touching in any other way, just sharing the warmth of the fire and the solid, reassuring pressure of his hand around hers. She leaned her head back against the stone of the hearth and, for the first time in her life, felt safe enough to fall asleep in the presence of a man. The fragile peace they had found was not destined to last. Whispers, like tumbleweeds, began to blow in from the east. A few lines in a letter from a distant cousin. A tidbit of gossip passed from one freighter to another. The story of the disgraced librarian from Pennsylvania began to circulate in the saloons and sewing circles of redemption. A juicy morsel for a town starved of scandal. Clara's quiet, reserved nature was reinterpreted as sullen guilt. Her elegance was seen as a sign of a duplicitous nature. The whispers took on a face one afternoon when they were in town. A man, a stranger with cold, calculating eyes and 2 pistols strapped to his hips, was leaning against the porch of the saloon. As Clara passed, his eyes narrowed in recognition. He pushed himself off the post and fell into step behind them. "Clara Maeve?" he said, his voice carrying a professional chill. Clara froze, the blood draining from her face. Elias turned, placing himself between her and the stranger. "She is Mrs. Thorne, and you are—" The man's lips curled into a semblance of a smile. "The name's Cutter. I'm a bounty hunter, and I remember a circular from back east, a reward offered by a prominent citizen named Abernathy for information leading to the whereabouts of one Clara Maeve, a woman of loose morals who fled after a scandalous affair." Every word was a hammer blow. The people on the street stopped to stare, their faces a mixture of shock and hungry curiosity. Clara felt the world tilt on its axis. It was happening again. The pointing fingers, the whispers, the public humiliation. She wanted to run, to disappear, but her feet were rooted to the spot. Elias's face was a mask of cold fury. "There is no reward here for you. Cutter, now move along." Cutter laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I am just passing along information. Thorne, a man ought to know who he is sharing his bed with." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near Clara's feet and sauntered back into the saloon. The silence on the street was deafening. Elias took Clara's arm, his grip like iron, and led her to the wagon. The ride home was a long, suffocating torment. Clara stared at the unending plains, her mind a blank slate of terror. He was going to send her away. Of course he was. No man would want a woman so thoroughly, so publicly disgraced. When they reached the homestead, he led her inside. He closed the door and stood before her, his face grim, his eyes searching hers. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice flat. And the dam broke. The story she had held inside for so long came pouring out, a torrent of shame and fear and righteous anger. She told him everything. About Mr. Abernathy's advances, about the struggle in the library, about the scar on her shoulder where he had thrown her against a bookshelf. She told him about Abernathy's lies, how he had twisted the story to save his own reputation, painting her as a temptress. She told him about the trial of public opinion, the scorn, the shunning, the letter from her own mother. She spoke until her voice was raw, until the tears were streaming down her face, until there was nothing left to say. She finished, her shoulders slumped, her entire body trembling, and waited for the verdict. She waited for him to throw her out into the wilderness. Elias was silent for a long time. his expression unreadable. He looked at her, at the raw pain etched on her face, at the defiant strength that still flickered in her tear-filled eyes. He took a step closer, and she flinched, expecting a blow or a gesture of dismissal. Instead, he slowly, deliberately, reached out and took her hand. He held it gently, his thumb stroking the back of her wrist. He looked directly into her eyes, and the winter in his own had thawed, replaced by a deep, unwavering warmth. "You are not what they called you," he said, his voice quiet but resonant with a conviction that shook her to her very soul. "I can see that." He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, his touch not one of possession, but of pure, unqualified protection. It was an anchor in the storm, a promise, "I am on your side." And in that moment, Clara knew that she was no longer alone. Elias's declaration hung in the air of the small cabin, a shield raised against the world, but a shield, Clara knew. Invites, attack. The days that followed were thick with a tension that was almost suffocating. The bounty hunter, Cutter, had done his work well. The poison of his words had seeped into the very soil of redemption. When they rode to town, the whispers were no longer behind their hands. They were a low, constant murmur, like the buzzing of angry hornets. Doors that had once been open were now closed to them. Faces that had once been merely curious were now hard with judgment. Elias seemed not to notice, or perhaps he chose not to. His jaw was set in a line of grim determination. He moved through the town with his head held high, his quiet strength a defiant challenge to the scornful eyes that followed them. But Clara noticed. She felt each stare like a physical blow, each whispered word a fresh cut on an old wound. She was a pariah, and she had made him one, too. The guilt was a heavy cloak she could not shrug off. Saturday evening, as he cleaned his rifle by the fire, he spoke without looking at her. "Tomorrow is Sunday. We will go to church." Clara's hands, which were kneading dough for the morning's bread, stilled. "Elias, no, we cannot." "We can," he said, his voice flat and final. "And we will. I will not have us hiding in our own home like criminals." "But they will stare. They will talk." "Let them talk," he said, finally looking up, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "Their words are just wind. You are my wife. You will sit by my side in the house of God. There is no shame in you, Clara. The shame belongs to those who judge what they do not understand." His words were meant to be a comfort, but they were a torment. He was a good man, an honorable man, and she was dragging his name through the mud. She was the scandal he was now forced to defend. The weight of it was unbearable. That night, she lay in her cold bed, the decision hardening in her heart like ice on a winter pond. She loved him. The realization was a sharp, sweet ache in her chest, and because she loved him, she had to leave. She rose before the first hint of dawn, the air in the cabin still and frigger. She moved like a phantom, dressing in the darkness, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her worn wool dress. She packed her few belongings into her small carpet bag. There was not much to pack. A change of clothes, her brush, the book of poetry, and the cruel letter from her mother. She paused, her hand hovering over a small, neatly folded pile of linen. They were handkerchiefs she had embroidered for Elias, his initial stitched in the corner with dark blue thread, a small, foolish gift she had planned to give him. She left them on the pillow of her bed. On the kitchen table, she left a note. Her hand trembled as she wrote, the pencil scratching loudly in the silence. "You are a good man, Elias Thorne. You deserve a life of peace, not scandal. I cannot be the cause of your ruin. Do not look for me." She did not sign her name. She did not need to. She slipped out the door and into the pre-dawn gloom. A fresh layer of snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the world in a pristine, unforgiving white. The cold was immediate and shocking, sinking its teeth into her through the thin wool of her coat. She did not take a horse, He would hear. She would walk the long miles to redemption and try to find a place on an eastbound stagecoach, to disappear back into the world that had cast her out. Every step was an agony, a betrayal of the only kindness she had ever known. But it was a necessary betrayal. She was cutting out the diseased part of his life, and that part was her. She had been walking for what felt like an eternity when she heard it. The rhythmic, muffled thud of hooves on snow, coming up fast behind her. Her heart leaped into her throat. She did not have to turn around to know who it was. She kept walking, her head bowed against the wind, her tracks a lonely, desperate line in the vast emptiness. He drew his horse up beside her, the animal's breath pluming in the frigid air. Elias did not dismount. He looked down at her from the saddle, his face a mask of stone, his coat flapping in the wind like the wings of a great, dark bird. Snowflakes clung to the brim of his hat and melted on the shoulders of his coat. "Where do you think you are going?" he asked, his voice low and raw.
"Away,"
she whispered, not looking at him. "I am leaving. You will be better off." "You think so?" The words were laced with a bitterness that startled her. "You think my life will be better without you in it? You think I will find peace in an empty house, with only the memory of your leaving to keep me warm?" She finally stopped and looked up at him, her face streaked with tears she had not realized she was shedding. "I am ruining you. Elias, can you not see that? I am a disgrace. They will never accept me. They will never accept you, as long as you are with me." He swung down from the horse, his boots sinking into the deep snow. He stood before her, so close she could feel the heat of him, could smell the scent of leather and winter air that clung to him. He reached out and gripped her by the shoulders, his hold firm but not harsh. "Let me tell you what I see," he said, his eyes boring into hers. "I see a woman who survived. I see a woman who is stronger than anyone in that town. I do not care about their acceptance. I care about you." He took a deep, shuddering breath, the raw emotion of the moment cracking his stoic facade. "You were hired to be a bride. Clara, a practical arrangement, nothing more. But I did not know. I did not know you would become the only thing I do not want to lose." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, shattering the icy wall of her resolve. All the pain, all the fear, all the desperate, unspoken longing of the past months rose up in her. "I am afraid," she sobbed, the words torn from her. "I am so afraid." "I know," he said, his voice softening. "But you do not have to be, not with me." She looked up at his face, at the harsh lines softened by a tenderness she had only dreamed of, and a truth she had been too scared to acknowledge finally broke free. "With you," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "For the first time in my entire life, I feel safe." The space between them vanished. He lowered his head and his lips met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of anger and profound, aching tenderness. It was the taste of snowflakes and unspoken confessions. Her hands came up to clutch the front of his coat, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. He pulled her flush against him, one hand tangled in her hair, the other pressing into the small of her back, molding her to him. They stood in the middle of the vast, silent, snow-covered plains, trembling, but not from the cold. It was their first shared act of true, undeniable desire, a spark of impossible heat in the heart of winter. When the kiss finally broke, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Come home, Clara," he whispered. He lifted her onto the horse and swung up behind her, his arms closing around her waist, pulling her back against the solid warmth of his chest. The ride back to the homestead was silent, the only sound the soft crunch of the horse's hooves in the snow. She leaned back against him, exhausted and overwhelmed, and let his strength support her. He carried her into the house, kicking the door shut behind them. He did not take her to her small, cold room. He carried her up the stairs, into his own room, a place she had never been, It was as spare and simple as the rest of the house, dominated by a large wooden bedstead. He laid her down on the quilt, his movements gentle, reverent. He was not a conqueror claiming his prize. He was a man bringing a fragile, precious thing into a sanctuary. He laid her down not to possess her, but to cradle her. And there, in the safety of his arms, she broke. The years of shame, of fear, of forced silence came pouring out in a storm of sobs that shook her entire body. She cried into his shoulder, and he held her, stroking her hair, whispering her name over and over again, his voice a low, steady anchor in her sea of grief. When the tears finally subsided, a profound, peaceful quiet settled in the room. The light from the window was soft and gray, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She lay beside him on the bed, her head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. Slowly, she pushed herself up. She looked into his eyes, and in their depths, she saw her own reflection, not as a broken, shamed thing, but as a woman who was loved. Her hand, trembling slightly, rose to the top button of her own blouse. She undid it, then the next, and the next. Her eyes never left his. This was not a surrender. It was an offering. It was her choice, her body, her trust, given freely. She took his large, calloused hand and guided it to her chest, placing it over her heart, over the thin cotton of her chemise. She felt the tremor that went through him at her touch. His fingers, which had been gentle before, were now filled with a different quality. They lingered on her skin, tracing the line of her collarbone with a touch so light it was barely there. It was a touch of reverence, not of need. It was a question, not a demand. They spent the rest of that day and all through the long, dark night lying on the bed, fully clothed, wrapped in each other's arms. They did not make love. They did something far more intimate. They whispered stories in the dark. He told her of Sarah, of their young love, of the crushing grief that had hollowed him out. She told him of her dreams of being a teacher, of her love for books, of the small joys that had been stolen from her. It was not a consummation of the flesh, but a consummation of trust, a weaving together of two lonely, broken souls. The next morning, they woke to a world reborn. The sun was shining. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the snow on the ground sparkled as if it were made of diamonds. For the first time, Clara woke up not with a sense of dread, but with a quiet, joyful peace. Elias rose first and went downstairs to start the fire. When he came back outside to fetch more wood, he stopped dead. Nailed to the rough-hewn wood of the new, half-built barn wall was a piece of crude planking. Scrawled on it in what looked like charcoal were 5 ugly words. "She belongs in jail, not here." Clara came to stand beside him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the morning chill. She saw the sign, and the familiar cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. But this time, it was different. It was joined by a hot, fierce surge of anger. Elias's face was dark with a silent, murderous rage. He reached out and ripped the sign from the wall, the nails screaming in protest. He broke the plank over his knee and threw the pieces into the snow. He turned to her, his eyes full of a grim promise. "I will protect you," he said, his voice a low growl. She looked at the broken sign in the snow, then at his determined face, and then at the small house that had become her home. A lifetime of running, of flinching, of hiding, fell away from her. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, her touch firm and steady. "I will not run," she said, and her own voice was a revelation to her, clear and strong. "I will fight for what we have." Clara's declaration was a line drawn in the snow, a border between the life she had fled and the one she intended to build. But borders, she was learning, are often seen as a challenge. Their fight was not a loud, violent thing. It was a war of attrition, fought in the cold stares and stony silences of the people of redemption. The change was palpable. It was in the way Silas Croft at the general store suddenly claimed to be out of the very seed grain he had offered to another rancher just moments before. It was in the way the blacksmith, a man Elias had known for years, took 3 days to shod their horse. His excuses as thin as his smile. The cruelest blows came from the children. They had learned the poison from their parents and distilled it into a sing-song taunt. As Clara walked from the wagon to the dressmaker's shop, a group of them playing in the muddy street began to chant, their voices high and piercing. Clara, Clara, full of shame, ran away and changed her name. They scattered like startled birds when Elias turned his cold, hard gaze on them. But their words lingered in the air, clinging to her like burrs. The old Clara would have shattered. The new Clara felt the sting, but it hardened into a cold, solid knot of resolve in her gut. This was her home. This was her husband. She would not let the ignorance of others drive her from it. They retreated further into the world they had built together on the homestead, their solitude a shield. They worked side by side, rebuilding the barn, the shared labor a language that required no words. A quiet, deep-seated tenderness grew between them, nurtured in the isolation. But the malice of the town was not content to remain at a distance. It came on a cold, gray afternoon. Elias was in the far pasture, checking on a newborn calf, when he noticed a section of fence was down, the posts deliberately pulled from the ground. As he dismounted to inspect the damage, a sudden, unnatural noise erupted from the ridge above. A series of sharp cracks, like gunfire, but not quite. It was the sound of whips cracking, of men yelling. The small herd of cattle grazing peacefully in the pasture lifted their heads, their eyes wide with panic. The noise grew louder, more frantic. The herd stirred, then bolted, a river of panicked flesh and thundering hooves. A stampede aimed directly at the gap in the fence and the open plains beyond. Elias was caught in the open. He leaped for his horse, trying to mount, to get ahead of the herd and turn them. But it was too late. The ground was shaking. A steer, blind with terror, slammed into his horse's flank. The animal screamed and went down, its legs tangling, and Elias was thrown clear, his body hitting the frozen ground with a sickening thud. He tried to scramble away, but his leg was caught, pinned beneath the thrashing body of his dying horse. The stampede swirled around him, a storm of hooves and horns. He felt a searing, white-hot pain in his leg, heard a sickening crack that was louder than the thunder of the herd, and then the world dissolved into a gray, featureless agony. Clara heard the stampede from the house, a low rumble that grew into a terrifying roar. She ran to the porch, her heart seizing with a cold, primal fear. She saw the river of cattle pouring through the broken fence, and she saw the still, unmoving shape of Elias's horse on the ground. She did not scream. She did not hesitate. The time for fear was a luxury she no longer had. She ran to the corral, saddled the mare with a speed and efficiency that would have been unthinkable months before, and galloped toward the pasture. The ride was a blur of wind and pounding hooves. She found him, half-conscious, his face ashen with pain, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle beneath the dead weight of his horse. "Elias!" she cried, leaping from the saddle. He gritted his teeth, his forehead beaded with sweat despite the cold. "My leg, it's broken. Clara, badly." She looked at the sheer size of the dead horse, then at Elias's trapped leg. She was not strong enough to move it. "I have to get help," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I have to ride to town." "No," he rasped, his eyes clouded with pain. "They will not help you." "They will," she said, her own eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire he had never seen before. "They have to—" She took the blanket from her saddle roll and tucked it around him, her hands gentle but swift. "I will be back. Elias, I promise you. Hold on." She mounted the mare and rode like the devil was on her heels. She did not spare the horse. Pushing it to a desperate, lung-searing gallop, the wind tore at her hair, whipping it free from its pins. She did not see the landscape. She saw only Elias's pale face, only the specter of the coming winter. She reached redemption in a cloud of dust and sweat, the mare's sides heaving. She did not stop at the doctor's office. She knew that was not where the heart of the town lay. She pulled the mare to a skidding halt in front of the one place where every man of consequence would be gathered in the late afternoon, the saloon. Without a moment's hesitation, she threw the reins over the hitching post and burst through the swinging doors. The saloon fell silent. The tinny piano music faltered and died. The clink of a glass, the scrape of a chair, the low murmur of conversation. It all stopped. Every man in the room, ranchers, prospectors, the blacksmith, even the bounty hunter Cutter, who was sitting at a back table, turned to stare at her. A woman, especially this woman, did not enter this place. She stood there, her dress spattered with mud, her hair a wild tangle around her face, her chest heaving for breath, and met their stunned gazes. She found the town doctor, a portly man named Harris, sitting at a poker table. "Dr. Harris," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that commanded attention. "My husband is hurt, a stampede. His leg is broken. He is pinned under his horse in the north pasture. I need the doctor, and I need men to help me lift the horse. Now." She was not pleading. She was not begging. She was issuing a command. The men stared, dumbfounded, at this transformed woman. This was not the timid, silent mail-order bride they had whispered about. This was a force of nature. Dr. Harris was the first to move, grabbing his black bag from the floor. One of the ranchers, a man named Patterson, who had been a friend of Elias's before the scandal, stood up. "I will get my wagon and some men," he said, his voice full of a new, grudging respect. Cutter watched from the back, a flicker of something unreadable in his cold eyes. But he did not move. Within minutes, a small group of men was assembled. They followed Clara out of town, her initial shock replaced by a cold, clear-headed focus. She led them to Elias. It took 4 men, their muscles straining, to lever the dead horse off his leg. Dr. Harris's examination was grim. "It is a bad break," he said, his face serious. "Shattered. We need to get him back to your homestead and set it, but Clara—" He paused, looking at her with a reluctant sympathy. He may never walk right again, and with winter coming on so fast, you two are in for a hard time. Clara's face was pale, but her expression did not falter. "We will manage, doctor," she said. "Just fix his leg." The days that followed were a blur of pain and exhaustion. Elias was delirious with fever for a week, his body fighting the shock of the injury. Clara became his nurse, his protector, his ranch hand. She did not sleep for more than an hour at a time. She bathed his feverish forehead with cool water, forced broth between his cracked lips, and changed the blood-soaked bandages on his leg. When the fever finally broke, the true work began. With Elias confined to his bed, the entire burden of the homestead fell on her shoulders. She rose before dawn to chop wood, her hands blistering and bleeding until they hardened into calluses. She hauled buckets of water from the well, her back and shoulders screaming in protest. She fed the livestock, mended the fences, and managed their dwindling supplies with a careful, desperate economy. She also learned how to shoot. Elias, his voice weak but his instructions clear, taught her from his bed. He had her take down his heavy Winchester rifle from the mantelpiece. "You need to know how to use it," he had said, his eyes dark with worry. "You need to be able to protect yourself." The rifle was heavy and awkward in her hands. The first time she fired it, the recoil knocked her back a step, and the blast left her ears ringing. But she did not give up. Every day, she practiced, shooting at tin cans set on a fence post until she could reliably hit her target, until the weight of the rifle felt like an extension of her own arm. The fragile, runaway bride was gone, burned away in the crucible of hardship. In her place stood a woman of iron will and quiet, formidable strength. One afternoon, as she was splitting logs, she saw a strange sight on the road. A fancy, covered buggy, the kind one saw in the cities of the East, was making its way toward the homestead. It was utterly out of place in this rough, wild country. A cold premonition slid down her spine. She rested her axe and waited, her hand never far from the rifle leaning against the woodpile. The buggy pulled to a stop. A man stepped out, a man in a fine wool coat and polished city boots. He was tall and handsome, with a self-assured smile that did not reach his eyes. Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was Mr. Abernathy. He saw her, and his smile widened. A predatory, possessive thing. "Clara, my dear," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, an obscene sound in the clean winter air. "It took a great deal of effort to find you. You have led me on quite a chase." "What are you doing here?" Clara asked, her voice low and steady. The girl who had trembled before this man was gone. "I have come to take you home," he said, as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. "This charade has gone on long enough. I have spoken to the people in that pathetic little town. They know what you are. They know you belong with me. This rancher of yours, Thorn. I hear he has had an accident. He cannot possibly care for you. I have come to collect my property." The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of his words lit a fire in Clara's soul. "I am not your property," she said, each word a piece of ice. "I am Mrs. Thorn, and this is my home. You are not welcome here. Leave." Abernathy's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of anger. "Do not be a fool. Clara, you have no place here. You are a soiled woman. I am the only one who will have you. Now come with me." He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched. Just then, the door to the cabin opened. Elias stood there, leaning heavily on a crude wooden crutch, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes blazing. In his other hand, he held the Winchester. Abernathy stopped, his eyes widening at the sight of the rifle. "She told you to leave," Elias said, his voice a low growl. Abernathy seemed to recover his composure. He sneered. "You think you can protect her, cripple? She will ruin you. I will see to it. I will tell every newspaper in the territory what she is." It was then that Clara made her stand. She walked past Abernathy, her head held high, and did not stop until she reached the road. She turned to face him, her voice ringing out in the cold. Clear air, a voice for Elias and the empty plains and God himself to hear. "My name is Clara Thorn," she declared, her voice shaking with the force of her conviction. "And I am not ashamed. You are the one who should be ashamed. You are a liar and a coward. You took my voice from me once. Mr. Abernathy, you silenced me with your lies and your power. Not this time." His face contorted with rage, his mask of civilized controls shattered. "You insolent little—" He lunged for her, his hand raised to strike. Clara stood her ground. She did not flinch. Before his hand could land, Elias's voice cut through the air, cold and deadly. "Touch her, and I will kill you where you stand." Abernathy froze, his hand hovering in the air. He looked at Clara's defiant face, then at Elias, leaning on his crutch but steady as a rock, the rifle aimed squarely at his chest. The man was a bully, accustomed to his victims cowering, faced with two people who refused to break. His courage failed him. With a snarl of frustrated rage, he lowered his hand, turned, and climbed back into his fine buggy. He whipped the horses and fled back down the road, a creature of the shadows retreating from the light. Clara and Elias stood together, watching him go. The town had not seen the confrontation, but it did not matter. She had faced her demon, and she had won. Her transformation was complete. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. She was a fighter. And she was home. The winter did not break. It retreated, slowly and grudgingly. like a defeated army. The great drifts of snow that had buried the world shrank day by day, leaving behind a land that was sodden and brown, scarred by the harshness of the season. But the sun, once a distant, pale coin in the sky, grew stronger, its warmth a promise that seeped into the frozen earth. And then, one morning, it happened. On the south-facing slope of the hill behind the house, a single, defiant purple crocus pushed its way through the last remnants of a snowbank. It was a herald. Soon, others followed. The brown hills began to blush with a faint, hopeful green. The creek, which had been locked in ice, broke free with a joyful roar, its water running high and clear. The air lost its sharp, biting edge and softened, carrying the scent of damp earth and new life. Spring had come to the high country. With the spring came a renewal of life that was mirrored in the two souls who had weathered the winter together. Elias's leg healed slowly, the shattered bone knitting itself back together with a stubborn resilience. He moved with a permanent limp, a physical reminder of the season that had almost broken them. But he moved with a new lightness in his spirit. The hollow, haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady warmth that was reserved for Clara alone. They sat together on the porch of the newly rebuilt cabin, the late afternoon sun warm on their faces. The new barn stood proud and strong behind them, its fresh-cut pines scenting the air. In the pasture below, a half-dozen newborn calves wobbled on spindly legs, their mothers watching over them with a placid, chewing contentment. Life was asserting itself, fragile and tenacious and beautiful. Clara leaned her head against the rough-hewn post, her hands resting quietly in her lap. A comfortable silence stretched between them, a silence no longer born of awkwardness or unspoken rules, but of a deep and easy companionship. She watched a calf, bolder than the rest, take a few clumsy, joyful leaps before returning to the safety of its mother's side. A soft smile touched her lips. She reached out and laid her hand on his, which rested on the arm of his chair. His skin was warm from the sun, the calluses on his palm a familiar, comforting map of his life's labor. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers, his grip firm and sure. "Still glad you hired me?" she teased, her voice soft, her eyes sparkling with a gentle mischief he was coming to know and cherish. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the depth of feeling in his gaze made her breath catch. The stern, distant rancher who had met her at the train station was gone. In his place was a man whose heart, long shuttered and barred, had been thrown open to the light. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I thought I hired a helper," he said, his voice low and thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Turns out I got a heart, a home, and a future." The words were simple, but they held the weight of everything they had endured, everything they had become. They were a vow, a confession, and a promise all in one. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a joy so profound it felt like a physical ache in her chest. They decided to be married at the end of the month, when the wildflowers were at their peak. It was not a decision born of necessity or arrangement, but of a simple, shared desire to sanctify the love that had grown between them. There was no formal proposal, no ring. There was only a quiet conversation one evening, a shared look that said everything that needed to be said. Their wedding day dawned bright and clear, the sky a vast, unblemished dome of blue. Clara did not have a white dress. She wore her best calico, a simple gown of pale blue sprigged with tiny yellow flowers, which she had mended and pressed with loving care. In her hair, she wove a crown of Indian paintbrush and bluebells that Elias had picked for her that morning from the meadow where he had first seen her smile. They were not married in the cold, judgmental church in town. They stood on the porch of their own home, the place that had been their sanctuary and their crucible. A traveling preacher, a kind-faced old man with a gentle voice, had agreed to make the journey out to their homestead. Their guests were few. There was Dr. Harris, who had saved Elias's leg and had come to admire the fierce resilience of his wife. There was Mr. Patterson, the rancher who had been the first to offer help, and his warm, smiling wife, Martha, who had brought them a freshly baked apple pie. That was all. They needed no others. The ceremony was short and simple. The preacher spoke of resilience, of finding love in unexpected places, of the beauty of a partnership forged in hardship. When it came time for the vows, Elias and Clara did not recite memorized words. They simply turned to each other. Elias took both of her hands in his. "Clara," he said, his voice husky but clear, "you came into my life when it was all winter. You brought the spring. You are my home." Clara looked up at him, her love for him shining in her eyes, open and unafraid. "Elias," she replied, her voice steady and true, "you taught me that I was not ruined. You taught me how to be strong. You gave me a place to stand. My heart is yours." The preacher pronounced them man and wife. Elias leaned down and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss full of reverence and quiet joy, a kiss that sealed not a contract, but a covenant. Martha Patterson wiped a tear from her eye, and even Dr. Harris looked a little misty. They ate apple pie on the porch as the sun began to set, painting the mountains in hues of rose and gold. It was not a grand celebration, but it was perfect. That night, for the first time, Clara entered Elias's room not as a guest, but as his wife. He had lit a single lamp, its golden glow filling the room with a soft, intimate light. The window was open, and a gentle breeze, carrying the sweet scent of pine and wildflowers, stirred the simple cotton curtains. An old, familiar tremor of fear, a ghost from her past, flickered in Clara's heart. Her body had been a source of shame and pain for so long. But then she looked at Elias, at the gentle, patient love in his eyes, and the fear dissolved like mist in the morning sun. He did not rush. He came to her and simply held her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," he whispered. He did not undress her. Instead, he slowly, reverently, took the wildflower crown from her hair, his fingers gentle in the long, dark tresses. He unpinned her hair, letting it fall in a cascade over her shoulders. Then he waited. It was she who moved first. Her hands, no longer trembling, came up to the buttons of his shirt. She undid them one by one, her fingers brushing against the warm skin of his chest. He stood perfectly still, allowing her this, giving her the control she had never had. When the shirt was open, she rested her palms flat against his heart, feeling its strong, steady beat beneath her hands. Then he reached for her. His large, calloused hands went to the buttons at the back of her dress. Each touch was a question, each movement slow and deliberate. There was no shame in his eyes, no grasping need. There was only a profound, overwhelming tenderness. As the dress loosened and fell away, he did not stare at her body. He looked into her eyes, his own full of a love that was a sanctuary. In the soft lamplight, they slowly, gently, undressed one another. It was a ritual of trust, an unwrapping of souls as much as bodies. Every touch was an affirmation, every glance a promise. For Clara, it was a reclamation. She was not an object of shame, not a vessel for a man's needs. In his arms, in his gaze, she was a woman, whole and beloved. She finally felt wholly, completely safe in her own skin. They lay together under the open window, the cool night air a soft caress. They did not speak. They listened to the symphony of the wilderness that surrounded them, the lonely, beautiful cry of the coyotes in the distant hills, the whisper of the wind through the pines, the gentle chirping of the crickets. These were the sounds of their home, the lullaby of their new life. Elias shifted, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her. His gaze was soft in the moonlight. He reached out and gently traced the line of her shoulder. His fingers found the faint, silvery mark that had once been the brand of her deepest shame. For a moment, she tensed, an involuntary, remembered flinching. He leaned down and pressed his lips to the scar. It was not a kiss of passion, but of acceptance, of healing. It was a kiss that honored her past, her pain, her survival. He lifted his head and looked into her eyes, his own shining with an unutterable love. "It is part of you," he whispered, his voice a low, gentle rumble in the quiet room. "And I love all of it." In that moment, the last of the ghosts fled, the last of the wounds closed. She was not just safe, she was whole. Sometime later, long after Elias had fallen asleep, his arm draped protectively over her, Clara lay awake, watching the moon travel across the sky. She thought of the frightened, broken girl she had been, a girl who believed her life was over. She thought of the long journey, the hardships, the fear, and the slow, miraculous blossoming of love in this wild, unforgiving place. She reached for the small journal and pencil she now kept by the bed. In the pale moonlight, she began to write a letter, a message sent back through time to the person she used to be. To the girl who hides in the shadows, she wrote, "The girl who believes she is ruined. You are not a vessel for other people's sins. You are not the ugly names they call you. Your worth is not a thing that can be taken from you. The scars they leave on you are not a mark of your shame, but a testament to the fact that you survived. You think your story is over, but it is just beginning. One day, you will learn that the wilderness you fear is the only place you can truly find yourself. You will learn that strength is not the absence of fear, but the courage to move forward in spite of it. You were never ruined. You were always becoming." Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.